I'd just like to welcome our panel of experts. Firstly, we have Henry Turner, Business Development Manager from Hawke. Henry, if you want to say a little hello.
Good morning. Hello.
Hi. We have Marty Cole, our Certifications Manager from Hubbell Canada.
Hello, everyone.
And we have Mike Schinner, our Fittings Product Manager from Killark, who was also monitoring the chat in one of our last sessions as well.
Hello.
All right, so let's kick off our session. So firstly, we're going to kick off with a general question that we received a few times. What are the differences between NEC and CEC gland applications? So Mike, if you want to kick us off with that.
Yeah, so the UL and CSA have kind of adopted a lot of the standards. They've come a long way to really co-collaborate each other. So they fed off the CEC and the NEC. There's really not a whole lot of difference between the two. A couple that stand out are maybe the testing requirements. So depending on who you're trying to get the certification through, it could vary what type of testing you need to do. For instance, CSA requires only 500 PSI for your gas groups in Class 1 Div 1. UL requires a much higher pressure test. Some of the ambient temperatures are a little different. For instance, I believe CSA is -50 to +40, whereas UL is -25 to plus 40. And if you want to get anything lower than that, that requires some added pressure based off a scale. For instance, you know, the NEC UL world primarily deals with a lot of conduit. Cable glands they're not new, but they're more new to the NEC market. So they're trying to adapt a lot of the rest of the world standards. But UL assumes that you're running cable from conduit. So that's why it requires a higher pressure test. But other than that, there's really not a whole hell of a lot of difference between the two.
Perfect. Marty or Henry, is there anything you would like to add to that?
When Mike mentioned some of the differences between how we test things, in Canada we corrected our standard that we test things to last year, and they're much closer to what we do together now. So there are a couple of different things with the different types of cables used in Canada or permitted in Canada that we deal with, but there's not tons of things anymore.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Henry, anything you would like to also add there?
No, I believe Mike and Marty both got it covered. So
perfect. Well, let's move on to our next question then. This is one of the ones we received via the Microsoft form. What are the characteristics you should look for in cable when selecting cable glands? Now, it's quite a wide question. So what things should you consider first, Mike, if you want to kick off with that one?
Yeah, and I think Henry and myself get this question a lot, especially with our salespeople, distribution. It's always the first thing you need to look at is your classifications. You know, if you're Class 1, your Class 1 Division 2, your standard location, whatever have you, you really need to know your classification. If it's Class 1 Div 1, then you need to make sure that you're speccing the right cable, whether the spec calls for armored cable or if it calls for unarmored cable. Then you really need to narrow it down from there. Now, and I know we'll get into this in a little bit, but really the CEC and the NEC plays in just in simplest terms, unarmored category and unarmored category. I'm sorry, armored category and unarmored category. The CEC world primarily deals with what in the Class 1 Div 1 applications is tech cable, whereas the NEC world kind of plays with MCHL, which is metal clad cable. We'll get into that in a little bit, but specifying your cable is just knowing your classifications, knowing what type of cable you need, and then you can hone in on your gland from there. But those are the kind of things that we would need to know when we want to help the customer try to figure out which gland is. Hey, we're going to ask you what cable type you're using, what's your OD of your armor, what's your OD of your jacket, and things like that. So that's really what we're looking for when we want to specify certain types of glands or cables.
Perfect, thank you. And do you want to talk a little bit more about types of cable that you typically see in NEC/CEC applications? I know you've touched on them, but maybe if we can go into them a little bit more.
Yeah, so I touched based on the two. So really, there's two major types of cables. There's your unarmored world and your armored world. So for CEC, primarily they deal with tech cable, and this is all Class 1 Division 1 applications we're talking. So your barrier glands. But Canada deals with tech, which is a interlocked type of cable. It's suitable for Class 1 Div 1. The NEC world deals with what we call metal clad, or MC or MCHL. And if it's MCHL, that means it's continuously corrugated. So it's almost like a long piece of tube, and I actually have one here. So this is your MCHL, and as you can see here, I'm actually putting pressure here to try to bend it. It's really not bending because it's one piece of tube continuously corrugated. The tech that I was referring to is interlocked, and it allows for a bend. So you guys can see here, but they're both good for Class 1 Div 1 in their respected applications. And then I touched base on an unarmored cable, and it's becoming more popular in the NEC world, and that's tray cable. So tray cable has been deemed now good for hazardous locations if it specifically meets the requirement of TCERHL, which stands for tray cable exposed around hazardous locations. So now that is an unarmored cable in a classified area, which is, again, something that is pretty new. The difference between the unarmored cable and the metal clad is that you can treat metal clad like conduit. So you can run it along walls, you can run it with clamps, straps. The tray cable you still have to treat as tray cable. You have to run it through cable tray. So it's going to go up in your ceilings and things like that and come down to your equipment. Tray cable is becoming more popular because it's pretty inexpensive to run. So the tray cable is not really predominantly used right now in the CEC market applications. I know Marty can back me up here, but I know that we talk about them mirroring each other's standards between UL and CSA, but this has not caught on yet to the CEC market. I'm sure it will eventually. And another thing about the unarmored cable for the NEC application is that UL only restricted it up to 1 inch in diameter. They now remove that restriction, and you can go to any inch as long as it has that stamp that says TCERHL. And if I missed anything, Marty, let me know about the unarmored cable in the CEC application.
No, the NEC is pretty good with telling you specifically which cables you're allowed to use. The CEC just tells you they have to be certified to a standard, C22.2 number 174. So it really doesn't explain what cables. We can use MCHL if it's certified to that standard. It's more difficult to use than tech cable, which is why we've used tech cable since the 70s here in Canada. MC cable is relatively new. It was the late 90s that they introduced it to the NEC. It's not that we can't have an unarmored cable. It's just no one's actually applied to 174 to have one. There was an issue before with the inspectors where they didn't like to see unarmored cable, even though it was permitted, but that's gone away. So that's all I wanted to add. One day we'll get an unarmored cable, and that'll take over our world.
Thank you. And Henry, any other types of cable that you see in the NEC world?
Absolutely. So one of the other cables we see a lot of, especially in the offshore world. So what Mike has touched on a little bit is probably a little more of the onshore type focus. In the offshore world, we also run into what's called Type P cable, and it's an IEEE 1580 standard, which goes over the applications for onshore and offshore applications. So up until this year, what they call the Type P cable, and I've got just a sample here. You see it's got like a braided jacket on it. You're still going to have an inner sheath and an outer sheath. But
sorry, if you want to just move that up a tiny little bit.
Sorry,
that's perfect. Thank you.
So instead of having your continuously welded corrugated or like your Tech 90 type jackets, they use this type of a jacket, which is typically a bronze. It can be a tin bronze, but it's kind of a basket weave type pattern, but this is where you're getting your mechanical protection. So very common cable offshore. It's been offshore for many, many years. and it's now being allowed to use in onshore applications as well, in a Class 1 Div 1 area. So that's one that will probably start getting out into the marketplace a little bit more as well.
Thank you.
And in
sorry,
offshore
Marty,
Canada, in offshore Canada, we can use Type P cable. Type P designation for the Canadian Electrical Code doesn't actually exist. We don't have a similar cable construction to that we identify. We have similar constructions, but we call them different things. In the new stuff for offshore, virtually any cable used in the world will be acceptable. So there's a little bit of difference between our offshore market and the US market, and we're a little bit closer to the rest of the world.
And as we get a little further into this discussion, we'll talk about the glands, but to be clear, our current offering, the MC2X series, is good for marine shipboard, but it has to be the unarmored type of marine shipboard. So it can't have that braided armored like Henry just showed. So the need has to arise for us to go ahead and get that braided armored marine shipboard certified. But right now we are certified for marine ship, just unarmored.
Perfect. Thank you for clarifying that one. The next question that we have is about cord. Can we use cord in a Class 1 Div 1 application? So
this is one of my favorite questions, but we get this quite often from a lot of salespeople, distribution, end users. Cord is completely acceptable to use in Class 1 Division 1 applications. For temporary power applications, so generators, pen and sleeve, things like that. So yeah, cord is perfectly acceptable. It's not by any means something that I would recommend using, but just to be clear, we're talking cables and cord. So there is a major difference between the two. Cord is very flexible. It requires a lot different testing than cable does. Aging oils, two types of aging. There's one oil, non-oil, and then it requires a stronger, a more heavier pull-out test than the cable does, because it's a lot more flexible. So you have that, I think it's called Poisson's theory, where it one and another, that your small factors in your middle. So it requires a larger weighted pull-out. But so our cable glands are currently, the MC2X series is not certified for cord. It is only good for cable. We do offer applications or ways to use cord in Class 1 Division 1 applications, and that is using one of our cord grips like the ZS series or the CG series with a seal-off fitting. So you do have to go into the cord, splice it, separate your conductors, pack your seal, pour your seal, and you're like you're making a makeshift plug, but with cord. So there is that option. Killark is currently working on a new type of cord grip that will be suitable for temporary power applications for cord in a C1D1 application. So.
Okay, great, thank you. Henry or Marty, anything you'd like to add there?
No, I'm not sure that our standard for cable glands for hazardous location actually separates cord and cable. They just certify. So I'll have to check that. We've got a meeting coming up where we'll discuss that on that standard.
I mean, on the NEC side, they are very specific with your types of cables and the types of glands. And when you get your gland certifications, it actually says if it's certified with marine shipboard cables and MC, MCHL, etc. So definitely something to be aware of when you're looking at your certifications and where the glands can be applied.
And it's also important to note that we have seen some MC type cable connectors or tech cable connectors where people have them certified for MC cable only, but not for tech. The pullouts are a little bit different between the two because the armor stretches. So some people don't have a certification for tech, so you have to be careful. Hawke and Killark have done a good job at making sure that all of theirs are certified.
That's a very good point, because when we do our testing, we always test to tech cable, which we said it's different and it's worst case scenario. So Killark always tests to the worst case scenario, and that's why we're certified for tech, MC, and unarmored tray cable as well. So we always do the worst case.
Right.
Okay, great points, guys. Thank you. I think it brings us on nicely to our next question, the topic we're all here to discuss, which is specifically about cable glands. So we've discussed cables, now let's talk about which gland you should use with each of them.
I'll go first, I guess, right? So very happy to talk about the MC2X series. We just launched it about, I think, 8 weeks ago. It is our second generation Class 1 Division 1 barrier gland. The 3 types of cable we just discussed are certified for all of those cables. So our MC2X series is certified for TC, ERHL, it's certified for Tech, it's certified for MCHL, and it is certified for marine unarmored shipboard cable. One of the major benefits, it is a patent pending cable gland, is that it has a disc brush dam. One of the benefits to this is that it's actually encases your conductors when you strip the cable. I don't know if any of you guys can see this, but when you prep your cable, you have to separate your individual conductors, and for most part your cable is a pretty good evenly a circular shape. When you prep your cables or your conductors, they don't turn into a perfect form circle anymore. So our competition uses what we call like a diaphragm seal, which expands around the cables. But again, you're not forming a perfect circle anymore. So now you're trying to fit a triangle into a circular shape. Our disc brush allows for the fibers, these nylon fibers that are all hundreds of these things inside this disc brush, kind of falls in between the space that you might have when you prep these cables. Another huge benefit to our cable gland is not only is it certified for all cable types and hazardous locations, but our resin solution. I know Hawke and Henry's going to talk about this, but our 7 series we just launched has Hawke Express, which is a 2-part epoxy resin that's all self-mix in a static nozzle. We launched Sealox about 2 years ago, which is basically the same thing for seals, but we also incorporated our Sealox and Hawke Express in our MC2X series. So this is, and I will stand by this, this is the fastest solution to a resin barrier gland on the market. The setup time is virtually nil. You remove the cap, you twist your nozzle on, and you are literally ready to pour your gland. It is reusable, which is huge, so it eliminates waste. You can specify these to different projects because we do have 4 sizes available. We have a 14 mil, 24 mil, which both come in a syringe style. We have a 50 mil, which comes in a little handgun cartridge style, and then we have Sealox, which is a 250 mil that is in a single barrel caulking tube, which is majorly beneficial because the contractors, most contractors are going to have a caulk gun somewhere, but the competition currently, their method is bag. So this is your resin for the competition, and that is you got to break this barrier between the 2 bags, mix the 2 compounds manually, which can take up to a minute, minute and a half, and then you have supposed to have enough for just 1 gland. Again, this is not reusable. It can harden. So when you're prepping your gland, and let's say you're a contractor, you're prepping your gland, and your boss comes in and says, "Hey, I need you over here real quick." You put this bag down. You didn't finish, the gland that you had started, and this bag will harden. So again, this is reusable. If you want to reuse it, leave the nozzle on. Let the resin harden inside the nozzle. When you want to go to reuse it, remove the nozzle, put a new one on, you're good to go. They all do have a pretty solid shelf life. I can't speak on Hawke Express. I can't remember off the top of my head, but I know the Sealox has a 18-month shelf life unopened and a 12-month shelf life when it is open. So it's just really good for specifying projects. All of our MC2X series comes with the traditional hand putty. So if your contractor is more comfortable using the hand putty, we gave that option as a standard. The resin is sold separately because we wanted to give the distributors, the customers, the power to specify their own resin for these glands. That way the distributor can buy X glands, he can buy X resin, keep it on a shelf. The contractor comes by and says, "Hey, I need 100 glands, but I only want to buy 2 250 milliliter tubes." Giving the power to basically the customers on that aspect. other than that, that's really the benefits to our gland. And there's tons of literature out there, videos. Please go to our website and check it out. I'm very proud of this launch, but yeah, that's all I have about the MC2X.
Perfect, thank you. Just a reminder that if you have a question, Brian, I could see you had your hand up just then. So if you have a question, if you want to just pop it in the chat, and we will get round to it as soon as possible. So just taking a step back there, if we could talk about the Hawke Solutions cable glands that we have available for the cables that we talked about previously.
Sure. So Hawke took a little bit of a different approach. You know, Killark has one gland that can do multiple types of armor, and Hawke's been in the game for a while as far as the hazardous area, class 1, div 1, div 2 market, and at the time, all of the glands we went through UL certifications, and getting our certifications with UL for the NEC certs, they wanted things to be very specific. So we took the approach of, and also trying to minimize the number of parts and glands and things like that. So for, you know, unarmored glands, we have the 710 series. For the MCHL Tech 90 cables, we have our 701, 711 series. And then for the Type P cables that I showed earlier, of course, on the Type P cables, you can get them both unarmored as well as armored and sheathed. So we have both the 710 and the 753 series. So they're very specific to the types of cables, but we have a wide range that's available, which makes it very easy for the customers to install in the field and select and stuff like that. So we have a wide array of products that we can offer as far as the actual glands go. And there's not cables out there we don't have a gland to be able to terminate it with. So lots of options. And it's very similar as what Mike was talking about as well. As far as how we do the terminations, we use the Hawke Express resin, which was, you know, launched about a little over a year ago. Exact same sizes. Just to kind of add on, he mentioned the 250 mil for the C-locks. We also have the 250 mil for the Hawke Express as well. That we're starting to actually receive that material. So we have that option as well. But and the key there, just like when Mike was showing the 2 poly bags that you have to mix up, we've talked to a lot of customers, and just the amount of time it takes to do that when you're having to terminate, especially if you're in a more of an OEM type setting and you're doing 10 to 15 to 20 glands at a time, they have to sit there and mix up each one of those every time to do a cable gland. Whereas with the injectables, especially if you make the move to the 50 mil and the 250 mil cartridges, you can just sit there and just very easily go from gland to gland, and it makes for a very quick pour. And even with the cure times that we have on there, I've seen them, depending on different temperatures, you know, within 10 to 15 minutes, you can start handling the materials and stuff like that. Just make sure you look at your temperature ranges and stuff like that and your curing times. But they do go off very fast, which is really nice. And they don't, with the mixing tips, they don't actually start mixing until they get into the actual tips themselves. So that makes it very nice, and that's how you're able to reuse the cartridges and stuff like that. So
yeah, the gel time is based on volume. So if you're using larger glands, just be careful. But yeah, like Henry said, our gel time is room temperature. It's 4 to 5 minutes, but you always want to check. But then you can lay that gland back down in a horizontal position and then go on to your next. So there's tremendous amounts of benefits. One thing I do want to mention is our MC2X gland is certified for both Hawke Express and C-locks. However, the 7 series is only certified for Hawke Express. So just keep that in mind. There was some issues with some aging. Hawke has to go through some different testing than UL does, and there was some aging testing that didn't allow for C-locks to be used in their gland. But don't want to get into the details, but just keep that in the back of your mind.
And we also still have the 2-part compound as well. So with the Hawke glands, you know, depending on your particular application, whether especially if you're in a situation where you need to do an immediate horizontal pour, So if you don't have the ability to hold the structure or have it in a vertical position, we do have the 2-part compound, which also cures much faster than the previous compounds did. Previous compounds took anywhere from 4 to 6 hours to cure. Now we've got the 2-part compound down to about a 30-minute cure time as well. But again, look at your temperature ranges and stuff like that. But that's we have a much faster curing time on the 2-part compound as well. So several different options, but the nice thing is we'll have that clear compound pot, which we'll go into a little bit later.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And you mentioned the 250 mil Express will be arriving in the US soon, Henry. Do you have a date for that specifically? We've just been asked the question from Rex in the chat there. Oh, you're on mute.
Sorry. It's my understanding that is supposed to be shipping this week from the factory out of the UK. So hopefully here by next week after, we should be in a position to start shipping that.
Perfect. Thank you. Okay, well, Marty, do you have anything you'd like to add there?
No, not really. I mean, we're pretty much following the same things, whether it's Hawke or Killark. As far as bonding compounds, everything is the same in both Canada and the US and around the world.
Perfect. Thank you. Well, the next question we have is, which gland should I use in Class 1 Div 1 applications?
I guess I'll run with that one. I'll start off with that one from a Hawke perspective. So the nice thing is, and I think, Marty mentioned earlier as well, that the NEC is very specific with the types of cables. So from a glanding perspective, it actually makes it pretty simple as long as you're using the right cables. And so your main cables, we've already kind of touched on some of these. So I'll start off with the unarmored type cables. You got your TCERHL cables. So from a Hawke perspective, that would be our 710 series if it's in a Class 1 Div 1. That's designed to seal on the outer jacket, as well as then you have your compound seal on the inner conductors. Something to note, and I don't know if we mentioned it earlier, but it's really great that we now have the TCERHL cable available to us in the Class 1 Div 1 area, but there are some very specific restrictions in areas where you can actually use that type of cable. It has to be either in the cable tray, and it also has to be in an area where people don't have normal access to. And you're also supposed to have qualified personnel around that cable. The biggest reason for that is otherwise you have to have the mechanical protection, which is why you then revert to your MCs, your MCHLs and your Type Ps, because they have that mechanical protection. So if that happens to be laying across the deck of a ship or across the ground or something like that, something hits it, it has that crush and impact testing. So it sounds real good to say, hey, we now have unarmored cable we can put in Div 1 areas, but there are some very specific restrictions and things that people need to be aware of before they just start thinking they can let that lay across the ground. So from a Hawke perspective, though, it would be the 710 series. And then moving on to your MCHLs, it's going to be your 711 gland. Again, it's going to seal on the outer jacket. We use a little bit of a different grounding system that secures against the armor itself. It provides a 360-degree ground clamp on that. And then, of course, you're going to have your seal around your individual conductors. And then when you move on to now that we have the Type P cables that are also certified for onshore, then you can also utilize those cables, which that's going to be the 753 series. Again, it's going to look very similar to the 711 glands in function. It's just you have a different type of armor that's on the inside of the cable. So you just have a different armor clamp on the inside that's going to allow you to clamp around that armor. And then, of course, provide a seal around the individual conductors with, of course, Hawke has the clear compound pot. So those are the basic glands that we have for specifically the Class 1 Div 1. I'm sure, Mike, you want to touch on yours as well for the Killark side of things.
Yeah, no, I mentioned earlier that all the what's good about the MC2X, especially for the CEC and the NEC world, is we're good for 99% of the hazardous Class 1 Division 1 cables, with the exception of that newly appointed Marine shipboard with the braided armor. Other than that, we are certified for all cable. Now, when you get into your Class 1 Div 1, one thing Henry and I kind of discussed before this is that regardless of who the cable manufacturer is, whether it be Southwire, whoever, or you have this new terminology called air guard, or you have these terminologies for cables because they're all different throughout the parts of the world. I know down south they call it CLX cable, which is basically continuously welded corrugated, which is your MCHL. Whether whoever is manufacturing your cables, they have to comply to a standard and in Class 1 Division 1. So if it's somebody comes to you and says, oh, hey, I don't know if this, just look at the specifications. It should tell you somewhere on there that this is TCERHL, or this is MCHL, or this is some form of tech. Manufacturers like to use marketing terms just like everybody else. It says, hey, this is the new air guard X, blah, 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 and this is the new CLX, blah, 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 blah. They're all going to comply to a standard that has that marking for Class 1 Division 1. And our MC2X is good for it. So
perfect. Thank you, guys. Marty, anything you'd like to add there?
Not really. Again, in Canada, we're less specific than in the US. So when we tell you it's good for hazardous location, it's going to be certified to that 174 standard. But in that, we also include cables that typically these glands are not intended for, like fiber optic cables and things like that. But we do have different sealing rules in the US, but we don't separate the two. We don't say you can't use this with cord. We don't say that in our requirement. So we're a little bit different. Maybe it's a little sloppy, I don't know, but it's the way it's been forever. Basically, if the gland's good for hazardous location, whatever cable you're allowed to use, it's good for.
Great, thank you. Just before we move into our next question, we've had a question from Rex on the chat. It's quite an interesting one. When should you use brass/nickel plated brass versus aluminium? And is there a preference in terms of Killark versus Hawke glands? So who wants to kick off with that one?
I mean, I can kind of, from a brass and nickel plated brass perspective, and probably even aluminum as well, the main thing to be aware of for brass is that if you're in an H2S environment, it will attack yellow metals. So that's why, in fact, we've just recently made it a standard in the US, even on the Hawke glands, that we now do fully nickel plating across the board. We've done the nickel plated entry threads as a standard for a while because they're typically going in the US, they go into aluminum enclosures. So we didn't want to have the bimetallic corrosion issue. And then, aluminum, I don't think there's any issues with the H2S, and that's why they're predominantly in the refineries and stuff like that. So with brass and nickel plated brass, you can see that, even from an offshore perspective, brass has been used around saltwater environments, but the most you'll get a slight discoloration, but there's absolutely no degradation to the actual material itself. But if you want to use nickel plated brass, then obviously the nickel plated brass, when you install that today, it's going to look the same 10 years from now, as long as they don't strip away the nickel plating during the installation process or something like that. But the only issue between when you start looking at the aluminum is you definitely want to make sure that if you have H2S, and just be aware that you're either using aluminum, nickel plated brass, or stainless steel is also another option, but it also tends to be a pretty pricey option when a lot of times nickel plated brass or an aluminum would work just as well. So I don't know, Mike, if you want to add anything else to that, or Marty.
Nope, I'm good.
Certainly on onshore, we have the issue with H2S, where it doesn't like yellow metals, and I'm pretty sure it's the same in the US as in Canada. Our installers don't necessarily use nice wrenches. They use channel locks, which rips off the coating. So they specifically don't allow that. They like aluminum because as the H2S hits it, it forms aluminum oxide on the outer portion of the aluminum, and that's a very good inhibitor for H2S. So
right,
it's
and that's
not
one
a
thing.
popular option.
Yeah, so when we do training gland termination training for Hawke, it's something that we definitely make sure that we cover is when you're terminating nickel-plated brass cable glands, make sure you're using the adjustable wrenches and not the wrenches with the jaws on them and stuff like that, serrated edges on them, to make sure you don't strip that nickel plating off. But the nickel plating does act as a great barrier. People use it all the time in the H2S areas as well as in saltwater environments, and no issues at all. But that is something to be aware of with nickel plated brass, is that you can strip that coating off. But it is a very durable product as well. And of course, then you can either go to aluminum or you can go to stainless steel. We love to sell stainless steel, but it's a little pricey. But we like to sell it.
Perfect, thank you. And as for the Hawke and Killark question, just to go back to the kind of start of the session, we kind of discussed at the start, looking at your spec, looking at the class and division that you're speccing, and the type of cable that you're using. Guessing the type of gland that you use from any of the Hubbell family depends on the way that you're speccing that product. It's just that we can offer it as one between Hawke and Killark. Is that right, guys?
That's correct. And what Henry and I always say, that no matter what your spec is and what you're needing, Hawke and Killark will have a solution for you. Between our two divisions, we will have what you need.
Yeah, it's a great compliment. Hawke has always probably been a little more known as the offshore guy here in the U.S. at least, because we didn't have an aluminum offering for the onshore market. And now we're all one happy family. We've got Killark and Hawke. So when we go into a job, we can look at it, what's the best solution for the customer? And if the customer needs aluminum, then we have the Killark offering. If it's something that they're going to be going on offshore and they prefer some type of a nickel plated brass, because at the end of the day, the end user is also going to have a preference as well. So what it does is it allows us to, if the end user has a preference for aluminum, then we can automatically just start focusing on the Killark products. And then if it's brass or nickel plated brass, then we can obviously offer the Hawke. So we can address it from both the materials issue, and then also if it's an environmental issue with H2S, then we have an automatic offering with the Killark product. If it's something that Killark doesn't have, then we can go to stainless steel. If that's an option and they have the time for that, then we have those options as well. So I think the best way to answer it is find the best solution for your customer, and we're going to have a product for you. We're all in this together, so we just want to make sure that we offer the best solution to the customer, and we have that offering between us.
Perfect, thank you. Well, I can see quite a few questions have come in through the chat, but I just want to cover one of the questions that we've received through the form, and one which I know you guys have received quite a few times, about the UL change to Class 1 Div 2 applications. So Mike and Henry, if you could just talk about that in a little bit more, just to clarify it for those people that have asked about it.
Yeah, so this comes up quite often is when you're speccing glands and you are in a Class 1 Division 2, which is going to be majority of your applications, which gland to use. Now, and Marty can correct me if I'm wrong, but about 4 or 5 years ago, Killark, Crouse-Hinds, Appleton, whoever, we were allowed to mark our products certified Class 1 Division 2 on our products, whether it be cord connectors or anything, more specifically our cable glands. So our MC, in 1 second.
Oh.
Our MC gland was no different. So this is an unanodized back nut. This indicates that it is not a barrier gland, not explosion proof. We were able to mark this Class 1 Division 2. Well, UL said, hey, listen, reviewing some things, this is going to confuse the market. People are going to actually use this in a Class 1 Division 2 application. That is not the case any longer. UL says you have to meet Class 1 Division 2, and for cable glands, that application is actually testing. So there is a test required for Class 1 Division 2, which requires you still to prep your cable, separate your conductors, pot around your individual conductors, but the pressure test is much lower. For UL, it's like 6,000 for Class 1 Division 1. For C1D2, it's more like 500, but you're still separating your conductors. You're still creating that flame path and allowing gas to, if there was an unnormal condition, not allow the gas to get into your cable system. Now, however, to not even add any mud to the water, this gland is suitable for use in Class 1 Division 2 locations, and that's what we can still say on our marketing terms, our literature, things like that. And that basically means that, for instance, a sheet metal enclosure that's Class 1 D2 rated, or a light fixture that's Class 1 D2 rated, those are already certified to Class 1 Division 2. This gland can be installed as long as there's no arcing, sparking, or heat producing apparatuses inside those equipment. So, for instance, like an SGIC box that's populated with terminals, there's no arcing, sparking inside there, so this gland is suitable. It does not derate that box or that enclosure. One major benefit to this gland is that it's got an O-ring in the entry component, and of course I don't have, this has been laying around my desk, there's no O-ring on here, but we created our entry component to have an O-ring for ingress protection. Majority of the calls that I've ever been on, and I'm sure Henry can contest to this as well, is that when you see a competitor's gland inside a sheet metal enclosure, you'll see a Myers hub with it. Ours, you don't need a Myers hub. You can go straight to the box with a lock nut on the other side, because that O-ring in here gives you your ingress protection. So I do want to point that out. That's one major benefit to this gland, is that you kind of eliminate some skews. But for the Class 1 D2 applications, if you are using a gland or need a gland that's Class 1 Division 2, our MC2X is certified for Class 1 Division 2. We withstand all the pressure, and for the majority of the time, you're going to be in a threaded enclosure, whether that be a GEC outlet body or something that's going to have threads to propagate flame. It should never ever be a sheet metal enclosure or things like that. So just keep kind of those things in the back of your mind. But the class, that whole change was kind of confusing when it first came out, but it should be a little bit more clear now. So I'm sure people might have some things to add to that.
Just one point, in Canada, we don't have a rating such as you have for Class 1 Division 2. We don't have the lesser gland. It's either Class 1 Division 1 or it's ordinary location, which is what we use in Class 1 Division 2. By the time you get a gland for Class 1 Division 2 that does have a potting chamber in it, you might as well use the most common one, that is the Class 1 Division 1. There's not much difference, especially with the new sealing compounds. So Canada has followed suit to say you can't market Class 1 Division 2 anymore. And that's important to understand for people. Also, it's a little confusing on heat producing products when we talk about sealing, because a light fixture is a heat producing product, but you don't necessarily need to have a barrier gland going into a Class 1 Division 2 light fixture, even though it does produce heat, because the heat's lower than the area, or you wouldn't be allowed to use that particular fixture. So it's really just, we're focused on arcing and sparking devices.
Perfect, thank you. Henry, anything you would like to add?
No, they covered it very well. I think the biggest thing is, you know, and where I think we're getting a lot of the confusion in the marketplace is that there's a lot of customers that they still want to see that Class 1 Div 2 on the gland if the box is marked that way, and that's why there's some confusion. Well, why can't we get that? And it's just, well, it's just the way the standards are written, and now they're just not allowing us to market that way. But the glands are still suitable for those applications. So it's really just going to, and you know, as it's taken a little bit of time to educate the market on that, and just to help them understand, you know, it's as to why we can't mark them anymore. But the glands are still suitable, even though we can't mark them that way. So.
And just to add into that, just so you understand that for cables, if they're going into Class 1 Division 1 or a Zone 1 area, going into any explosion-proof type enclosure, whether it's factory sealed or not, the cable must be sealed going into that enclosure. If the enclosure is in a Class 1 Division 2 area, it doesn't matter if it's an explosion-proof box, Class 1 Division 1, or a flame-proof enclosure, you must seal that cable going into that box because it has arcing and sparking devices. We wouldn't expect to find arcing and sparking devices in an ordinary location box in those areas. As far as factory sealing in a Class 1 Division 2, you don't have to seal that box, but you do in Division 1 in all cases.
Okay, thank you. Well, I am conscious we were due to finish at 1:45 and now we're running about 5 minutes over, but we do have quite a few questions in the chat. So if you can only be with us until, if you're waiting to go, please by all means, you can go. But Mike, Marty and Henry, if it's okay with you, we can just stay on for a couple more minutes and answer some of those questions in the chat. Okay, sure. Great. So the first one is from Eduardo. Are there any additional requirements for cables installed in a barrier cable gland, Class 1 Div 1, if the cable is wired by a conduit system? Meaning using a conduit plus barrier cable gland without an external sheath on the cable.
So now you're getting into more of probably a seal-off type of situation if you're running cable or conductors through conduit. There is instances where you could run Class 1 Div 1 barrier cable gland into whatever enclosure, and then you're running your cable through a conduit. You should be fine using that conduit if you want to run your cable through conduit after you barrier it to whatever device, but you'll still need a seal off into your transitional classification area. So if you're in a Class 1 Div 1, you have your barrier gland in your electrical device, and then you run your cable through conduit. Maybe you have a separation of 6 inches, whatever. You have no arcing, sparking because your sheath is protected. You still have to have your seal in your transition, your Class 1 Division 1 to a Class 1 D2 change. So you'll still have to have a seal off in there as well.
Okay, great.
It would be somewhat unusual to have cable and conduit.
That is, I've run across it, but yeah, that is true.
I mean, people have done that in the past, tried to make it work, but realistically, we have the sealing fittings, conduit fittings for that purpose that use the same Celox material for sealing them off. So it'd be really unusual to have that combination of conduit and a gland.
Okay, thank you. Oh, Eduardo has said in our application, the installation with conduit is all in the same hazardous area.
He's just making a point. Yeah, no, that makes sense.
Just okay. So Lee David has said, are there any micron requirements on NEC/CEC for nickel plating? What's the micron on Hawke glands?
I can't remember the actual micron requirement. I know it's almost like a flash plating, but we can get the specifics from our technical guys on that just to make sure. But the main thing to understand is that we have some very fine machine threads within the gland itself. So you don't just want to take a gland to your local nickel plater that's used to doing nickel plating on chrome rims or bumpers or something like that, because they're going to apply such a thick coating of plating that you won't be able to get the glands to go back together again. So we can definitely get the standard. There's not a standard per se that says it has to be that, but Hawke has some recommendations as far as what the thickness should be. And we can get that if you're wanting to get something like that done on your own.
Okay, perfect. Well, we'll be in touch after the session then to confirm that one. And Gavin has asked, what cable standard and what glands are relevant for Class 1 Zone 2?
I mean, they're pretty much the same as for Division 2.
Yeah, so again, Marty's going to say it's basically the same thing we just talked about.
Right, and the U.S. has UL 2225 that has a Class 1 Division 2 gland. Canada does not. So they're just ordinary location standards, and I have to go back and figure out what the ordinary location standards for cable glands are. I don't remember them off the top of my head. It's ordinary stuff.
Okay, well,
Yeah,
we can...
as Marty said, the one thing to remember, though, is that a lot of people are going to equate class and zones. They're going to try to compare that exactly as the zones under your ATEX and IECEX, and you can't really do that. You want to make sure you're aware of when he was talking about your zone 2 is going to be similar to your div 2, your zone 1 is going to be similar to your div 1. That's true, and you need to be aware of that. It's not a direct cross to the ATEX and IECEX standards as some people think.
And
right.
And the gland, this MC gland should be suitable for Class 1 Zone 2 groups 2C Zone 20. So that's on our marking, on our certification. So just keep that in mind.
Yeah, at the end of the day, you just really want to make sure you're looking at the codes and standards. There are some issues that happened out in the Gulf, in the U.S. The Coast Guard has taken exception to certain standards as a result of the misinterpretations of class and zones in comparison to zones and divisions in comparison to zones. And as a result, they've put some pretty strict guidelines out there as to what standards are and aren't allowed on offshore vessels specifically. So it's something, don't just assume that class and zone is the same as zones when you're looking at your ATEX and IECEX standards.
Correct.
Perfect. Yeah, really good points. Thank you. Okay. I think that is all the questions we have on there. I know we had a few more submitted via the form and a few more points we wanted to cover, but I think we're just about at time now, so we'll potentially have to cover those in another session. So I'd like to thank our panelists for joining us for the session today. Thank you all of you, and thank you to everyone that joined us. We have been recording this meeting, so a recording will be with you as soon as we can possibly get it over to you. Thank you again for joining us, and if you want to find out any more about any of the topics we've covered today, head to the Hawke and Killark websites. Thank you very much.
Follow us on LinkedIn and on any of the other social media platforms for the latest launches, announcements, etc., etc. So just follow us, and we update that daily.
Yeah, good point. I'm sure, hopefully most of you found us via our LinkedIn post as well and enjoyed the video. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks a lot, folks.
Thank you.
Bye.